Section 19 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce Peary. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. The Russian Point of View. Doubtful as we frequently are, whether either the French or the Americans, who have so much in common with us, can yet understand English literature, we must admit graver doubts whether, for all their enthusiasm, the English can understand Russian literature. Debate might protract itself indefinitely as to what we mean by understand. Instances will occur to everybody of American writers in particular, who have written with the highest discrimination of our literature and of ourselves, who have lived a lifetime among us, and finally have taken legal steps to become subjects of King George. For all that, have they understood us? Have they not remained to the end of their days foreigners? Could anyone believe that the novels of Henry James were written by a man who had grown up in the society which he describes? Or that his criticism of English writers was written by a man who had read Shakespeare without any sense of the Atlantic Ocean and 200 or 300 years on the far side of it, separating his civilization from ours? A special acuteness and detachment, a sharp angle of vision the foreigner will often achieve, but not that absence of self-consciousness, that ease and fellowship and sense of common values which make for intimacy and sanity and the quick give and take of familiar intercourse. Not only have we all this to separate us from Russian literature, but a much more serious barrier, the difference of language. Of all those who feasted upon Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov during the past 20 years, not more than one or two, perhaps, have been able to read them in Russian. Our estimate of their qualities has been formed by critics who have never read a word of Russian, or seen Russia, or even heard the language spoken by natives, who have had to depend blindly and implicitly upon the work of translators. What we are saying amounts to this, then, that we have judged a whole literature stripped of its style. When you have changed every word in a sentence from Russian to English, have thereby altered the sense a little, the sound, weight, and accent of the words in relation to each other completely, nothing remains except a crude and coarsened version of the sense. Thus treated, the great Russian writers are like men deprived by an earthquake or a railway accident, not only of all their clothes, but also of something subtler and more important, their manners, the idiosyncrasies of their characters. What remains is, as the English have proved by the fanaticism of their admiration, something very powerful and very impressive, but it is difficult to feel sure, in view of these mutilations, how far we can trust ourselves not to impute, to distort, to read into them an emphasis which is false. They have lost their clothes, we say, in some terrible catastrophe, for some such figure as that describes the simplicity, the humanity, startled out of all effort to hide and disguise its instincts, which Russian literature, whether it is due to translation or to some more profound cause, makes upon us. We find these qualities steeping it through, as obvious in the lesser writers as in the greater. Learn to make yourselves akin to people. I would even like to add, make yourself indispensable to them, but let this sympathy be not with the mind, for it is easy with the mind, but with the heart, with love towards them. From the Russian, one would say instantly, wherever one chanced on that quotation, The simplicity, the absence of effort, the assumption that in a world bursting with misery, the chief call upon us is to understand our fellow sufferers, and not with the mind, for it is easy with the mind, but with the heart. This is the cloud which broods over the whole of Russian literature, which lures us from our own parched brilliancy and scorched thoroughfares to expand in its shade, and of course with disastrous results. We become awkward and self-conscious, denying our own qualities. We write with an affectation of goodness and simplicity, which is nauseating in the extreme. We cannot say brother with simple conviction. There is a story by Mr. Galsworthy in which one of the characters so addresses another. They are both in the depths of misfortune. Immediately everything becomes strained and affected. The English equivalent for brother is mate, a very different word, with something sardonic in it, an indefinable suggestion of humor. Met though they are in the depths of misfortune, the two Englishmen who thus accost each other will, we are sure, find a job, make their fortunes, spend the last years of their lives in luxury, and leave a sum of money to prevent, poor devils, from calling each other brother on the embankment. But it is common suffering, rather than common happiness, effort, or desire, that produces the sense of brotherhood. It is the deep sadness which Dr. Hagbert Wright finds typical of the Russian people that creates their literature. A generalization of this kind will, of course, even if it has some degree of truth when applied to the body of literature, be changed profoundly when a writer of genius sets to work on it. At once, other questions arise. It is seen that an attitude is not simple. It is highly complex. Men reft of their coats and their manners, stunned by a railway accident, say hard things, harsh things, unpleasant things, difficult things, even if they say them with the abandonment and simplicity which catastrophe has bred in them. Our first impressions of Chekhov are not of simplicity, but of bewilderment. What is the point of it, and why does he make a story out of this? We ask as we read story after story. A man falls in love with a married woman, and they part and meet, and in the end are left talking about their position and by what means they can be free from this intolerable bondage. How, he asked, clutching his head, and it seemed as though in a little while the solution would be found, and then a new and splendid life would begin. That is the end. A postman drives a student to the station, and all the way the student tries to make the postman talk, but he remains silent. Suddenly the postman says, unexpectedly, "It's against the regulations to take anyone with the post." And he walks up and down the platform with a look of anger on his face. With whom was he angry? Was it with people, with poverty, with the autumn nights? Again, that story ends. But is it the end, we ask? We have rather the feeling that we have overrun our signals, or it is as if a tune had stopped short without the expected chords to close it. These stories are inconclusive, we say, and proceed to frame a criticism based upon the assumption that stories ought to conclude in a way that we recognize. In so doing, we raise the question of our own fitness as readers. Where the tune is familiar and the end emphatic, lovers united, villains discomfited, intrigues exposed, as it is in most Victorian fiction, we can scarcely go wrong. But where the tune is unfamiliar, and the end a note of interrogation, or merely the information that they went on talking, as it is in Chekhov, we need a very daring and alert sense of literature to make us hear the tune. and in particular those last notes which complete the harmony. Probably we have to read a great many stories before we feel, and the feeling is essential to our satisfaction, that we hold the parts together, and that Chekhov was not merely rambling disconnectedly, but struck now this note, now that, with intention, in order to complete his meaning. We have to cast about in order to discover where the emphasis in these strange stories rightly comes. Chekhov's own words give us a lead in the right direction. Such a conversation as this between us, he says, would have been unthinkable for our parents. At night they did not talk, but slept sound. We, our generation, sleep badly, are restless, but talk a great deal, and are always trying to settle whether we are right or not. Our literature of social satire and psychological finesse both sprang from that restless sleep, that incessant talking. But after all, there is an enormous difference between Chekhov and Henry James, between Chekhov and Bernard Shaw. Obviously, but where does it arise? Chekhov, too, is aware of the evils and injustices of the social state. The condition of the peasants appalls him, but the reformer's zeal is not his. That is not the signal for us to stop. The mind interests him enormously. He is a most subtle and delicate analyst of human relations. But again, no, the end is not there. Is it that he is primarily interested not in the soul's relation with other souls, but with the soul's relation to health, with the soul's relation to goodness? These stories are always showing us some affectation, pose, insincerity. Some woman has got into a false relation. Some man has been perverted by the inhumanity of his circumstances. The soul is ill. The soul is cured. The soul is not cured. Those are the emphatic points in his stories. Once the eye is used to these shades, half the conclusions of fiction fade into thin air. They show like transparencies with a light behind them, gaudy, glaring, superficial. The general tidying up of the last chapter, the marriage, the death, the statement of values so sonorously trumpeted forth, so heavily underlined, become of the most rudimentary kind. Nothing is solved, we feel. Nothing is rightly held together. On the other hand, the method which at first seemed so casual, inconclusive, and occupied with trifles, now appears the result of an exquisitely original and fastidious taste, choosing boldly, arranging infallibly, and controlled by an honesty for which we can find no match save among the Russians themselves. There may be no answer to these questions, but at the same time let us never manipulate the evidence so as to produce something fitting, decorous, agreeable to our vanity. This may not be the way to catch the ear of the public. After all, they are used to louder music, fiercer measures, but as the tune sounded, so has he written it. In consequence, as we read these little stories about nothing at all, the horizon widens. The soul gains an astonishing sense of freedom. In reading Chekhov, we find ourselves repeating the word soul again and again. It sprinkles his pages. Old drunkards use it freely. You are high up in the surface beyond all reach, but haven't real soul, my dear boy. There's no strength in it. Indeed, it is the soul that is the chief character in Russian fiction. Delicate and subtle in Chekhov, subject to an infinite number of humors and distempers, it is of greater depth and volume in Dostoevsky, liable to violent diseases and raging fevers, but still the predominant concern. Perhaps that is why it needs so great an effort on the part of an English reader to read The Brothers Karamazov or The Possessed a second time. The soul is alien to him. It is even antipathetic. It has little sense of humor and no sense of comedy. It is formless. It has slight connection with the intellect. It is confused, diffuse, tumultuous, incapable, it seems, of submitting to the control of logic or the discipline of poetry. The novels of Dostoevsky are seething whirlpools, gyrating sandstorms, waterspouts which hiss and boil and suck us in. They are composed purely and wholly of the stuff of the soul. Against our wills we are drawn in, whirled round, blinded, suffocated, and at the same time filled with a giddy rapture. Out of Shakespeare there is no more exciting reading. We open the door and find ourselves in a room full of Russian generals, the tutors of Russian generals, their stepdaughters and cousins, and crowds of miscellaneous people who are all talking at the tops of their voices about their most private affairs. But where are we? Surely it is the part of a novelist to inform us whether we are in an hotel, a flat, or hired lodging. Nobody thinks of explaining. We are souls, tortured, unhappy souls, whose only business it is to talk, to reveal, to confess, to draw up at whatever rending of flesh and nerve those crabbed sins which crawl on the sand at the bottom of us. But as we listen, our confusion slowly settles. A rope is flung to us. We catch hold of a soliloquy. Holding on by the skin of our teeth, we are rushed through the water. Feverishly, wildly, we rush on, now submerged, now in a moment of vision, understanding more than we have ever understood before, and receiving such revelations as we are wont to get only from the press of life at its fullest. As we fly, we pick it all up, the names of the people, their relationships, that they are staying in a hotel at Roulettenberg, that Paulina is involved in an intrigue with the Marquis de Gurieu. But what unimportant matters these are compared with the soul. It is the soul that matters, its passion, its tumult, its astonishing medley of beauty and vileness. And if our voices suddenly rise into shrieks of laughter, or if we are shaken by the most violent sobbing, what more natural? It hardly calls for remark. The pace at which we are living is so tremendous that sparks must rush off our wheels as we fly. Moreover, when the speed is thus increased, and the elements of the soul are seen, not separately in scenes of humor or scenes of passion, as our slower English minds conceive them, but streaked, involved, inextricably confused, a new panorama of the human mind is revealed. The old divisions melt into each other. Men are at the same time villains and saints. Their acts are at once beautiful and despicable. We love and we hate at the same time. There is none of that precise division between good and bad to which we are used. Often those for whom we feel most affection are the greatest criminals, and the most abject sinners move us to the strongest admiration as well as love. Dashed to the crest of the waves, bumped and battered on the stones at the bottom, it is difficult for an English reader to feel at ease. The process to which he is accustomed in his own literature is reversed. If we wished to tell the story of a general's love affair, and we should find it very difficult in the first place not to laugh at a general, we should begin with his house. We should solidify his surroundings. Only when all was ready should we attempt to deal with the general himself. Moreover, it is not the samovar, but the teapot that rules in England. Time is limited, space crowded. The influence of other points of view, of other books, even of other ages, makes itself felt. Society is sorted out into lower, middle, and upper classes, each with its own traditions, its own manners, and to some extent its own language. Whether he wishes it or not, there is constant pressure upon an English novelist to recognize these barriers, and in consequence, order is imposed on him, and some kind of form. He is inclined to satire rather than to compassion, to scrutiny of society rather than understanding of individuals themselves. No such restraints were laid on Dostoevsky. It is all the same to him whether you are noble or simple, a tramp or a great lady. Whoever you are the vessel of this perplexed liquid, this cloudy, yeasty, precious stuff, the soul. The soul is not restrained by barriers. It overflows, it floods, it mingles with the souls of others. The simple story of a bank clerk who could not pay for a bottle of wine spreads, before we know what is happening, into the lives of his father-in-law and the 5 mistresses whom his father-in-law treated abominably, and the postman's life, and the charwoman's, and the princesses who lodged in the same block of flats, for nothing is outside Dostoevsky's province. And when he is tired, he does not stop. He goes on. He cannot restrain himself. Out it tumbles upon us, hot, scalding, mixed, marvelous, terrible, oppressive, the human soul. There remains the greatest of all novelists, for what else can we call the author of War and Peace? Shall we find Tolstoy, too, alien, difficult, a foreigner? Is there some oddity in his angle of vision, which, at any rate until we have become disciples and so lost our bearings, keeps us at arm's length in suspicion and bewilderment? From his first words we can be sure of one thing at any rate. Here is a man who sees what we see, who proceeds to as we are accustomed to proceed, not from the inside outwards, but from the outside inwards. Here is a world in which the postman's knock is heard at 8 o'clock, and people go to bed between 10 and 11. Here is a man, too, who is no savage, no child of nature. He is educated. He has had every sort of experience. He is one of those born aristocrats who have used their privileges to the full. He is metropolitan, not suburban. His senses, his intellect are acute, powerful, and well-nourished. There is something proud and superb in the attack of such a mind and such a body upon life. Nothing seems to escape him. Nothing glances off him unrecorded. Nobody, therefore, can so convey the excitement of sport, the beauty of horses, and all the fierce desirability of the world to the senses of a strong young man. Every twig, every feather sticks to his magnet. He notices the blue or red of a child's frock, the way a horse shifts its tail, the sound of a cough, the action of a man trying to put his hands into pockets that have been sewn up. And what his infallible eye reports of a cough or a trick of the hands, his infallible brain refers to something hidden in the character, so that we know his people not only by the way they love and their views on politics and the immortality of the soul, but also by the way they sneeze and choke. Even in a translation, we feel that we have been set on a mountain top and had a telescope put into our hands. Everything is astonishingly clear and absolutely sharp. Then suddenly, just as we are exulting, breathing deep, feeling at once braced and purified, some detail, perhaps the head of a man, comes at us out of the picture in an alarming way, as if extruded by the very intensity of its life. Suddenly a strange thing happened to me. First I ceased to see what was around me. Then his face seemed to vanish till only the eyes were left, shining over against mine. Next the eyes seemed to be in my own head, and then all became confused. I could see nothing and was forced to shut my eyes in order to break loose from the feeling of pleasure and fear which his gaze was producing in me. Again and again we share Masha's feelings in family happiness. One shuts one's eyes to escape the feeling of pleasure and fear. Often it is pleasure that is uppermost. In this very story there are two descriptions, one of a girl walking in a garden at night with her lover, one of a newly married couple prancing down their drawing-room, which so convey the feeling of intense happiness that we shut the book to feel it better. But always there is an element of fear, which makes us, like Masha, wish to escape from the gaze which Tolstoy fixes on us. Does it arise from the sense, which in real life might harass us, that such happiness as he describes is too intense to last, that we are on the edge of disaster? Or is it not that the very intensity of our pleasure is somehow questionable and forces us to ask, with Podnshev in the Kreutzer Sonata, but why live? Life dominates Tolstoy, as the soul dominates Dostoevsky. There is always at the center of all the brilliant and flashing petals of the flower this scorpion. Why live? There is always at the center of the book some Olenin or Pierre or Levin who gathers into himself all experience, turns the world round between his fingers, and never ceases to ask, even as he enjoys it, what is the meaning of it, and what should be our aims? It is not the priest who shatters our desires most effectively. It is the man who has known them and loved them himself. When he derides them, the world indeed turns to dust and ashes beneath our feet. Thus fear mingles with our pleasure, and of the three great Russian writers, it is Tolstoy who most enthralls us and most repels. But the mind takes its bias from the place of its birth, and no doubt when it strikes upon a literature so alien as the Russian, flies off at a tangent far from the truth. End of section 19.
Section 20 of the Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. Outlines. Miss Mitford. Speaking truthfully, Mary Russell Mitford and Her Surroundings is not a good book. It neither enlarges the mind nor purifies the heart. There is nothing in it about prime ministers, and not very much about Miss Mitford. Yet, as one is setting out to speak the truth, one must own that there are certain books which can be read without the mind and without the heart, but still with considerable enjoyment. To come to the point, the great merit of these scrapbooks, for they can scarcely be called biographies, is that they license mendacity. One cannot believe what Miss Hill says about Miss Mitford, and thus one is free to invent Miss Mitford for oneself. Not for a second do we accuse Miss Hill of telling lies. That infirmity is entirely ours. For example, Alresford was the birthplace of one who loved nature as few have loved her, and whose writings breathe the air of the hayfields and the scent of the hawthorn boughs, and seem to waft to us the sweet breezes that blow over ripened cornfields and daisied meadows. It is perfectly true that Miss Mitford was born at Alresford, and yet, when it is put like that, we doubt whether she was ever born at all. Indeed, she was, says Miss Hill. She was born on the 16th December, 1787. A pleasant house in truth it was, Miss Mitford writes. The breakfast room was a lofty and spacious apartment. So Miss Mitford was born in the breakfast room about 8:30 on a snowy morning, between the doctor's second and third cups of tea. "Pardon me," said Mrs. Mitford, turning a little pale, but not omitting to add the right quantity of cream to her husband's tea. "I feel—" That is the way in which mendacity begins. There is something plausible and even ingenious in her approaches. The touch about the cream, for instance, might be called historical, for it is well known that when Mary won £20,000 in the Irish lottery, the doctor spent it all upon Wedgwood china, the winning number being stamped upon the soup plates in the middle of an Irish harp, the whole being surmounted by the Mitford arms, and encircled by the motto of Sir John Bertram, one of William the Conqueror's knights, from whom the Mitfords claimed descent. "Observe," says mendacity, "with what an air the doctor drinks his tea, and how she, poor lady, contrives to curtsy as she leaves the room." Tea? I inquire, for the doctor, though a fine figure of a man, is already purple and profuse, and foams like a crimson cock over the frill of his fine laced shirt. Since the ladies have left the room, mendacity begins, and goes on to make up a pack of lies with the sole object of proving that Dr. Mitford kept a mistress in the purlieus of reading, and paid her money on the pretense that he was investing it in a new method of lighting and heating houses invented by the Marquis de Chavannes. It came to the same thing in the end, to the King's Bench prison, that is to say. But instead of allowing us to recall the literary and historical associations of the place, mendacity wanders off to the window, and distracts us again by the platitudinous remark that it is still snowing. There is something very charming in an ancient snowstorm. The weather has varied almost as much in the course of generations as mankind. The snow of those days was more formally shaped, and a good deal softer than the snow of ours, just as an 18th century cow was no more like our cows than she was like the florid and fiery cows of Elizabethan pastures. Sufficient attention has scarcely been paid to this aspect of literature, which, it cannot be denied, has its importance. Our brilliant young men might do worse when in search of a subject than devote a year or two to cows in literature, snow in literature, the daisy in Chaucer, and in Coventry Patmore. At any rate, the snow falls heavily. The Portsmouth mail coach has already lost its way, several ships have foundered, and Margate Pier has been totally destroyed. At Hatfield Peveril 20 sheep have been buried, and though one supports itself by gnawing wurzels which it has found near it, there is grave reason to fear that the French king's coach has been blocked on the road to Colchester. It is now the 16th of February, 1808. Poor Mrs. Mitford! 21 years ago she left the breakfast room, and no news has yet been received of her child. Even mendacity is a little ashamed of itself, and, picking up Mary Russell Mitford and her surroundings, assures us that everything will come right if we possess ourselves in patience. The French king's coach was on its way to Barking. At Barking lived Lord and Lady Charles Murray Ainsley, and Lord Charles was shy. Lord Charles had always been shy. Once when Mary Mitford was 5 years old, 16 years, that is, before the sheep were lost and the French king went to Barking, Mary threw him into an agony of blushing by running up to his chair in mistake for that of my papa. He had, indeed, to leave the room. Miss Hill, who, somewhat strangely, finds the society of Lord and Lady Charles pleasant, does not wish to quit it without introducing an incident in connection with them, which took place in the month of February, 1808. But is Miss Mitford concerned in it, we ask, for there must be an end of trifling. To some extent, that is to say, Lady Charles was a cousin of the Mitfords, and Lord Charles was shy. Mendacity is quite ready to deal with the incident, even on these terms, but, we repeat, we have had enough of trifling. Miss Mitford may not be a great woman. For all we know, she was not even a good one, but we have certain responsibilities as a reviewer, which we are not going to evade. There is, to begin with, English literature. A sense of the beauty of nature has never been altogether absent, however much the cow may change from age to age from English poetry. Nevertheless, the difference between Pope and Wordsworth in this respect is very considerable. Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, Our Village in 1824. One being in verse and the other in prose, it is not necessary to labor a comparison, which contains, however, not only the elements of justice, but the seeds of many volumes. Like her great predecessor, Miss Mitford much preferred the country to the town, and thus, perhaps, it may not be inopportune to dwell for a moment upon the King of Saxony, Mary Anning, and the Ichthyosaurus. Let alone the fact that Mary Anning and Mary Mitford had a Christian name in common, they are further connected by what can scarcely be called a fact, but may, without hazard, be called a probability. Miss Mitford was looking for fossils at Lyme Regis only 15 years before Mary Anning found one. The King of Saxony visited Lyme in 1844, and seeing the head of an ichthyosaurus in Mary Anning's window, asked her to drive to Piney and explore the rocks. While they were looking for fossils, an old woman seated herself in the king's coach. Was she Mary Mitford? Truth compels us to say that she was not. But there is no doubt, and we are not trifling when we say it, that Mary Mitford often expressed a wish that she had known Mary Anning, and it is singularly unfortunate to have to state that she never did. For we have reached the year 1844. Mary Mitford is 57 years of age, and so far, thanks to mendacity and its trifling ways, all we know of her is that she did not know Mary Anning, had not found an ichthyosaurus, had not been out in a snowstorm, and had not seen the King of France. It is time to wring the creature's neck and begin again at the very beginning. What considerations, then, had weight with Miss Hill when she decided to write Mary Russell Mitford and Her Surroundings? 3 emerge from the rest, and may be held of paramount importance. In the first place, Miss Mitford was a lady. In the second, she was born in the year 1787. And in the third, the stock of female characters who lend themselves to biographic treatment by their own sex is, for one reason or another, running short. For instance, little is known of Sappho, and that little is not wholly to her credit. Lady Jane Grey has merit, but is undeniably obscure. Of George Sand, the more we know, the less we approve. George Eliot was led into evil ways, which not all her philosophy can excuse. The Brontes, however highly we rate their genius, lacked that indefinable something which marks the lady. Harriet Martineau was an atheist. Mrs. Browning was a married woman. Jane Austen, Fanny Burney, and Maria Edgeworth have been done already, so that, what with one thing and another, Mary Russell Mitford is the only woman left. There is no need to labor the extreme importance of the date when we see the word "surroundings" on the back of a book. Surroundings, as they are called, are invariably 18th century surroundings. When we come, as of course we do, to that phrase which relates how, as we looked upon the steps leading down from the upper room, we fancied we saw the tiny figure jumping from step to step, it would be the grossest outrage upon our sensibilities to be told that those steps were Athenian, Elizabethan, or Parisian. They were, of course, 18th century steps, leading down from the old paneled room into the shady garden where, tradition has it, William Pitt played marbles, or, if we like to be bold, where on still summer days we can almost fancy that we hear the drums of Bonaparte on the coast of France. Bonaparte is the limit of the imagination on one side, as Monmouth is on the other. It would be fatal if the imagination took to toying with Prince Albert, or sporting with King John. But fancy knows her place, and there is no need to labor the point that her place is the 18th century. The other point is more obscure. One must be a lady. Yet what that means, and whether we like what it means, may both be doubtful. If we say that Jane Austen was a lady, and that Charlotte Brontë was not one, we do as much as need be done in the way of definition, and commit ourselves to neither side. It is undoubtedly because of their reticence that Miss Hill is on the side of the ladies. They sigh things off and they smile things off, but they never seize the silver table by the legs or dash the teacups on the floor. It is in many ways a great convenience to have a subject who can be trusted to live a long life without once raising her voice. 16 years is a considerable stretch of time, but of a lady it is enough to say, "Here Mary Mitford passed 16 years of her life, and here she got to know and love not only their own beautiful grounds, but also every turn of the surrounding shady lanes." Her loves were vegetable, and her lanes were shady. Then, of course, she was educated at the school where Jane Austen and Mrs. Sherwood had been educated. She visited Lyme Regis, and there is mention of the Cobb. She saw London from the top of St. Paul's, and London was much smaller then than it is now. She changed from one charming house to another, and several distinguished literary gentlemen paid her compliments and came to tea. When the dining-room ceiling fell down, it did not fall on her head, and when she took a ticket in a lottery, she did win the prize. If in the foregoing sentences there are any words of more than 2 syllables, it is our fault, and not Miss Hill's. And to do that writer justice, there are not many whole sentences in the book which are neither quoted from Miss Mitford nor supported by the authority of Mr. Crissey. But how dangerous a thing is life! Can one be sure that anything not wholly made of mahogany will to the very end stand empty in the sun? Even cupboards have their secret springs, and when inadvertently we are sure Miss Hill touches this one, out, terrible to relate, topples a stout old gentleman. In plain English, Miss Mitford had a father. There is nothing actually improper in that. Many women have had fathers. But Miss Mitford's father was kept in a cupboard. That is to say, he was not a nice father. Miss Hill even goes so far as to conjecture that when an imposing procession of neighbors and friends followed him to the grave, we cannot help thinking that this was more to show sympathy and respect for Miss Mitford than from special respect for him. Severe as the judgment is, the gluttonous, bibulous, amorous old man did something to deserve it. The less said about him, the better. Only, if from your earliest childhood your father has gambled and speculated, first with your mother's fortune, then with your own, spent your earnings, driven you to earn more, and spent that too; if in old age he has lain upon a sofa and insisted that fresh air is bad for daughters; if, dying at length, he has left debts that can only be paid by selling everything you have, or sponging upon the charity of friends, then even a lady sometimes raises her voice. Miss Mitford herself spoke out once. It was grief to go. There I had toiled and striven, and tasted as deeply of bitter anxiety, of fear, and of hope, as often falls to the lot of woman. What language for a lady to use, for a lady, too, who owns a teapot! There is a drawing of the teapot at the bottom of the page, but it is now of no avail. Miss Mitford has smashed it to smithereens. That is the worst of writing about ladies. They have fathers as well as teapots. On the other hand, some pieces of Dr. Mitford's Wedgwood dinner service are still in existence, and a copy of Adam's Geography, which Mary won as a prize at school, is in our temporary possession. If there is nothing improper in the suggestion, might not the next book be devoted entirely to them? End of section 20.
Section 21 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce Peary. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. Outlines 2. Dr. Bentley. As we saunter through those famous courts where Dr. Bentley once reigned supreme, we sometimes catch sight of a figure hurrying on its way to chapel or hall, which, as it disappears, draws our thoughts enthusiastically after it. For that man, we are told, has the whole of Sophocles at his finger ends, knows Homer by heart, reads Pindar as we read the Times, and spends his life, save for these short excursions to eat and pray, wholly in the company of the Greeks. It is true that the infirmities of our education prevent us from appreciating his emendations as they deserve. His life's work is a sealed book to us. None the less, we treasure up the last flicker of his black gown, and feel as if a bird of paradise had flashed by us, so bright is his spirit's raiment, and in the murk of a November evening we had been privileged to see it winging its way to roost in fields of amaranth and beds of moly. Of all men, great scholars are the most mysterious, the most august. Since it is unlikely that we shall ever be admitted to their intimacy or see much more of them than a black gown crossing a court at dusk, the best we can do is to read their lives. For example, the Life of Dr. Bentley by Bishop Monk. There we shall find much that is odd and little that is reassuring. The greatest of our scholars, the man who read Greek as the most expert of us read English, not merely with an accurate sense of meaning and grammar, but with a sensibility so subtle and widespread that he perceived relations and suggestions of language which enabled him to fetch up from oblivion lost lines and inspire new life into the little fragments that remained. The man who should have been steeped in beauty, if what they say of the classics is true, as a honey pot is ingrained with sweetness, was, on the contrary, the most quarrelsome of mankind. I presume that there are not many examples of an individual who has been a party in 6 distinct suits before the Court of King's Bench within the space of 3 years, his biographer remarks, and adds that Bentley won them all. It is difficult to deny his conclusion that though Dr. Bentley might have been a first-rate lawyer or a great soldier, such a display suited any character rather than that of a learned and dignified clergyman. Not all these disputes, however, sprung from his love of literature. The charges against which he had to defend himself were directed against him as master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He was habitually absent from chapel. His expenditure upon building and upon his household was excessive. He used the college seal at meetings which did not consist of the statutable number of 16, and so on. In short, the career of the Master of Trinity was one continuous series of acts of aggression and defiance, in which Dr. Bentley treated the Society of Trinity College as a grown man might treat an importunate rabble of street boys. Did they dare to hint that the staircase at the lodge, which admitted 4 persons abreast, was quite wide enough? Did they refuse to sanction his expenditure upon a new one? Meeting them in the great court one evening after chapel, he proceeded urbanely to question them. They refused to budge. Whereupon, with a sudden alteration of color and voice, Bentley demanded whether they had forgotten his rusty sword. Mr. Michael Hutchinson and some others, upon whose backs the weight of that weapon would have first descended, brought pressure upon their seniors. The bill for £350 was paid, and their preferment secured. But Bentley did not wait for this act of submission to finish his staircase. So it went on, year after year. Nor was the arrogance of his behavior always justified by the splendor or utility of the objects he had in view: the creation of the backs, the erection of an observatory, the foundation of a laboratory. More trivial desires were gratified with the same tyranny. Sometimes he wanted coal, sometimes bread and ale. And then Madame Bentley, sending her servant with a snuff-box in token of authority, got from the butteries, at the expense of the college, a great deal more of these commodities than the college thought that Dr. Bentley ought to require. Again, when he had 4 pupils to lodge with him who paid him handsomely for their board, it was drawn from the college, at the command of the snuff-box, for nothing. The principles of delicacy and good feeling, which the master might have been expected to observe, great scholar as he was, steeped in the wine of the classics, went for nothing. His argument that the few college loaves upon which the 4 young patricians were nourished were amply repaid by the 3 sash windows which he had put into their rooms at his own expense, failed to convince the fellows. And when, on Trinity Sunday, 1719, the fellows found the famous college ale not to their liking, they were scarcely satisfied when the butler told them that it had been brewed by the master's orders, from the master's malt, which was stored in the master's granary, and, though damaged by an insect called the weevil, had been paid for at the very high rates which the master demanded. Still, these battles over bread and beer are trifles, and domestic trifles at that. His conduct in his profession will throw more light upon our inquiry. For, released from brick and building, bread and beer, patricians and their windows, it may be found that he expanded in the atmosphere of Homer, Horace, and Manilius, and proved in his study the benign nature of those influences which have been wafted down to us through the ages. But there the evidence is even less to the credit of the dead languages. He acquitted himself magnificently, all agree, in the great controversy about the letters of Phalaris. His temper was excellent and his learning prodigious. But that triumph was succeeded by a series of disputes which force upon us the extraordinary spectacle of men of learning and genius, of authority and divinity, brawling about Greek and Latin texts, and calling each other names for all the world like bookies on a race course or washerwomen in a back street. For this vehemence of temper and virulence of language were not confined to Bentley alone. They appear, unhappily, characteristic of the profession as a whole. Early in life, in the year 1691, a quarrel was fastened upon him by his brother chaplain Hodie for writing Malalas, not, as Hodie preferred, Malala. A controversy in which Bentley displayed learning and wit, and Hodie accumulated endless pages of bitter argument against the letter S, ensued. Hodie was worsted, and there is too much reason to believe that the offence given by this trivial cause was never afterwards healed. Indeed, to mend a line was to break a friendship. James Gronovius of Leyden, homunculus eruditione mediocri, ingenio nullo, as Bentley called him, attacked Bentley for 10 years because Bentley had succeeded in correcting a fragment of Callimachus where he had failed. But Gronovius was by no means the only scholar who resented the success of a rival with a rancor that gray hairs and 40 years spent in editing the classics failed to subdue. In all the chief towns of Europe lived men like the notorious De Pauw of Utrecht, a person who has justly been considered the pest and disgrace of letters, who, when a new theory or new edition appeared, banded themselves together to deride and humiliate the scholar. All his writings, Bishop Monk remarks of De Pauw, prove him to be devoid of candor, good faith, good manners, and every gentlemanly feeling, and while he unites all the defects and bad qualities that were ever found in a critic or commentator, he adds one peculiar to himself, an incessant propensity to indecent allusions. With such tempers and such habits, it is not strange that the scholars of those days sometimes ended lives made intolerable by bitterness, poverty, and neglect by their own hands, like Johnson, who, after a lifetime spent in the detection of minute errors of construction, went mad and drowned himself in the meadows near Nottingham. On May 20th, 1712, Trinity College was shocked to find that the professor of Hebrew, Dr. Syke, had hanged himself sometime this evening before candlelight in his sash. When Custer died, it was reported that he too had killed himself, and so in a sense he had, for when his body was opened, there was found a cake of sand along the lower region of his belly. This, I take it, was occasioned by his sitting nearly double and writing on a very low table, surrounded with 3 or 4 circles of books placed on the ground, which was the situation we usually found him in. The minds of poor schoolmasters, like John Kerr of the Dissenting Academy, who had had the high gratification of dining with Dr. Bentley at the lodge, when the talk fell upon the use of the word equidem, were so distorted by a lifetime of neglect and study that they went home, collected all uses of the word equidem which contradicted the doctor's opinion, returned to the lodge, anticipating in their simplicity a warm welcome, met the doctor issuing to dine with the Archbishop of Canterbury, followed him down the street in spite of his indifference and annoyance, and, being refused even a word of farewell, went home to brood over their injuries and wait the day of revenge. But the bickerings and animosities of the smaller fry were magnified, not obliterated, by the doctor himself in the conduct of his own affairs. The courtesy and good temper which he had shown in his early controversies had worn away. A course of violent animosities and the indulgence of unrestrained indignation for many years had impaired both his taste and judgment in controversy, and he condescended, though the subject in dispute was the Greek Testament, to call his antagonist maggot, vermin, gnawing rat, and cabbage head, to refer to the darkness of his complexion, and to insinuate that his wits were crazed, which charge he supported by dwelling on the fact that his brother, a clergyman, wore a beard to his girdle. Violent, pugnacious, and unscrupulous, Dr. Bentley survived these storms and agitations, and remained, though suspended from his degrees and deprived of his mastership, seated at the lodge imperturbably, wearing a broad-brimmed hat indoors to protect his eyes, smoking his pipe, enjoying his port, and expounding to his friends his doctrine of the digamma. Bentley lived those 80 years which, he said, were long enough to read everything which was worth reading. Et tunc, he added in his peculiar manner, et tunc magna mei sub terris ibit imago. A small square stone marked his grave in Trinity College, but the fellows refused to record upon it the fact that he had been their master. But the strangest sentence in this strange story has yet to be written, and Bishop Monk writes it as if it were a commonplace requiring no comment. For a person who was neither a poet nor possessed of poetical taste to venture upon such a task was no common presumption. The task was to detect every slip of language in Paradise Lost, and all instances of bad taste and incorrect imagery. The result was notoriously lamentable. Yet in what, we may ask, did it differ from those in which Bentley was held to have acquitted himself magnificently? And if Bentley was incapable of appreciating the poetry of Milton, how can we accept his verdict upon Horace and Homer? And if we cannot trust implicitly to scholars, and if the study of Greek is supposed to refine the manners and purify the soul— But enough. Our scholar has returned from Hall. His lamp is lit, his studies are resumed, and it is time that our profane speculations should have an end. Besides, all this happened many, many years ago. End of section 21.
Section 22 of the Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greta Budkute. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. Outlines. Free. Lady Dorothy Nevill. She had stayed, in a humble capacity, for a week in the ducal household. She had seen the troops of highly decorated human beings descending in couples to eat and descending in couples to bed. She had, surreptitiously, from a gallery, observed the Duke himself dusting the miniatures in the glass cases, while the Duchess let her crochet fall from her hands as if in utter disbelief that the world had need of crochet. From an upper window she had seen, as far as eye could reach, gravel paths swerving round aisles of greenery and losing themselves in little woods designed to shed the shade without the severity of forests. She had watched the ducal carriage bowling in and out of the prospect, and returning a different way from the way it went. And what was her verdict? A lunatic asylum. It is true that she was a lady's maid, and that Lady Dorothy Nevill, had she encountered her on the stairs, would have made an opportunity to point out that that is a very different thing from being a lady. My mother never failed to point out the folly of workwomen, shop girls, and the like, calling each other ladies. All this sort of thing seemed to her to be mere vulgar humbug, and she did not fail to say so. What can we point out to Lady Dorothy Nevill? That with all her advantages she had never learned to spell, that she could not write a grammatical sentence, that she lived for 87 years and did nothing but put food into her mouth and slip gold through her fingers? But delightful though it is to indulge in righteous indignation, it is misplaced if we agree with the lady's maid that high birth is a form of congenital insanity, that the sufferer merely inherits the diseases of his ancestors and endures them, for the most part, very stoically in one of those comfortably padded lunatic asylums which are known euphemistically as the stately homes of England. Moreover, the Walpoles are not ducal. Horace Walpole's mother was a Miss Shorter. There is no mention of Lady Dorothy's mother in the present volume, but her great-grandmother was Mrs. Oldfield, the actress, and to her credit, Lady Dorothy was exceedingly proud of the fact. Thus she was not an extreme case of aristocracy. She was confined rather to a birdcage than to an asylum. Through the bars she saw people walking at large, and once or twice she made a surprising little flight into the open air. A gayer, brighter, more vivacious specimen of the caged tribe can seldom have existed, so that one is forced at times to ask whether what we call living in a cage is not the fate that wise people condemned to a single sojourn upon earth would choose. To be at large is, after all, to be shut out, to waste most of life in accumulating the money to buy and the time to enjoy what the Lady Dorothys find clustering and glowing about their cradles when their eyes first open, as hers opened in the year 1826 at number 11 Berkeley Square. Horace Walpole had lived there. Her father, Lord Orford, gambled it away in one night's play the year after she was born. But Walterton Hall in Norfolk was full of carving and mantelpieces, and there were rare trees in the garden and a large and famous lawn. No novelist could wish a more charming and even romantic environment in which to set the story of two little girls growing up, wild yet secluded, reading Bossuet with their governess, and riding out on their ponies at the head of the tenantry on polling day. Nor can one deny that to have had the author of the following letter among one's ancestors would have been a source of inordinate pride. It is addressed to the Norwich Bible Society, which had invited Lord Orford to become its president. I have long been addicted to the gaming table. I have lately taken to the turf. I fear I frequently blaspheme, but I have never distributed religious tracts. All this was known to you and your society, notwithstanding which you think me a fit person to be your president. God forgive your hypocrisy. It was not Lord Orford who was in the cage on that occasion, but alas, Lord Orford owned another country house, Ilsington Hall, in Dorsetshire, and there Lady Dorothy came in contact first with the mulberry tree and later with Mr. Thomas Hardy, and we get our first glimpse of the bars. We do not pretend to the ghost of an enthusiasm for sailors' homes in general. No doubt mulberry trees are much nicer to look at, but when it comes to calling people vandals who cut them down to build houses, and to having footstools made from the wood, and to carving upon those footstools inscriptions which testify that often and often has King George III taking his tea under this very footstool, then we want to protest. Surely you must mean Shakespeare. But as her subsequent remarks upon Mr. Hardy tend to prove, Lady Dorothy does not mean Shakespeare. She warmly appreciated the works of Mr. Hardy and used to complain that the county families were too stupid to appreciate his genius at its proper worth. George III drinking his tea, the county families failing to appreciate Mr. Hardy. Lady Dorothy is undoubtedly behind the bars. Yet no story more aptly illustrates the barrier which we perceive hereafter between Lady Dorothy and the outer world than the story of Charles Darwin and the blankets. Among her recreations, Lady Dorothy made a hobby of growing orchids and thus got into touch with a great naturalist. Mrs. Darwin, inviting her to stay with them, remarked with apparent simplicity that she had heard that people who moved much in London society were fond of being tossed in blankets. I am afraid, her letter ended, we should hardly be able to offer you anything of that sort. Whether in fact the necessity of tossing Lady Dorothy in a blanket had been seriously debated at dawn, or whether Mrs. Darwin obscurely hinted her sense of some incongruity between her husband and the lady of the orchids, we do not know. But we have a sense of two worlds in collision, and it is not the Darwin world that emerges in fragments. More and more do we see Lady Dorothy hopping from perch to perch, picking at groundsel here and at hempseed there, indulging in exquisite trills and roulades, and sharpening her beak against a lump of sugar in a large, airy, magnificently equipped bird cage. The cage was full of charming diversions. Now she illuminated leaves which had been macerated to skeletons. Now she interested herself in improving the breed of donkeys. Next she took up the cause of silkworms, almost threatened Australia with a plague of them, and actually succeeded in obtaining enough silk to make a dress. Again, she was the first to discover that wood, gone green with decay, can be made at some expense into little boxes. She went into the question of funguses and established the virtues of the neglected English truffle. She imported rare fish, spent a great deal of energy in vainly trying to induce storks and Cornish choughs to breed in Sussex, painted on china, emblazoned heraldic arms, and attaching whistles to the tails of pigeons produced wonderful effects as of an aerial orchestra when they flew through the air. To the Duchess of Somerset belongs the credit of investigating the proper way of cooking guinea pigs, but Lady Dorothy was one of the first to serve up a dish of these little creatures at luncheon in Charles Street. But all the time the door of the cage was ajar. Raids were made into what Mr. Nevill calls Upper Bohemia, from which Lady Dorothy returned with authors, journalists, actors, actresses, or other agreeable and amusing people. Lady Dorothy's judgment is proved by the fact that they seldom misbehaved, and some indeed became quite domesticated, and wrote her very gracefully turned letters. But once or twice she made a flight beyond the cage herself. These horrors, she said, alluding to the middle class, are so clever and we are so stupid. But then look how well they are educated, while our children learn nothing but how to spend their parents' money. She brooded over the fact. Something was going wrong. She was too shrewd and too honest not to lay the blame partly, at least, upon her own class. I suppose she can just about read, she said of one lady calling herself cultured, and of another, she is indeed curious and well adapted to open bazaars. But to our thinking, her most remarkable flight took place a year or two before her death in the Victoria and Albert Museum. I do so agree with you, she wrote, though I ought not to say so, that the upper class are very, I don't know what to say, but they seem to take no interest in anything but golfing, etc. One day I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum, just a few sprinkles of legs, for I'm sure they looked too frivolous to have bodies and souls attached to them. But what softened the sight to my eyes were two little Japs poring over each article with a handbook. Our bodies, of course, giggling and looking at nothing. Still worse, not one soul of the higher class visible. In fact, I never heard of any one of them knowing of the place, and for this we are spending millions. It is all too painful. It was all too painful, and the guillotine, she felt, loomed ahead. That catastrophe she was spared, for who could wish to cut off the head of a pigeon with a whistle attached to its tail? But if the whole birdcage had been overturned and the aerial orchestra sent screaming and fluttering through the air, we can be sure, as Mr. Joseph Chamberlain told her, that her conduct would have been a credit to the British aristocracy. End of section 22.
Section 23 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce Peary. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. Outlines 4. Archbishop Thomson. The origin of Archbishop Thomson was obscure. His great-uncle may reasonably be supposed to have been an ornament to the middle classes. His aunt married a gentleman who was present at the murder of Gustavus III of Sweden, and his father met his death at the age of 87 by treading on a cat in the early hours of the morning. The physical vigor which this anecdote implies was combined, in the Archbishop, with powers of intellect which promised success in whatever profession he adopted. At Oxford, it seemed likely that he would devote himself to philosophy or science. While reading for his degree, he found time to write the Outlines of the Laws of Thought, which immediately became a recognized textbook for Oxford classes. But though poetry, philosophy, medicine, and the law held out their temptations, he put such thoughts aside, or never entertained them, having made up his mind from the first to dedicate himself to divine service. The measure of his success in the more exalted sphere is attested by the following facts. Ordained deacon in 1842 at the age of 23, he became Dean and Bursar of Queen's College, Oxford in 1845, Provost in 1855, Bishop of Gloucester and Bristol in 1861, and Archbishop of York in 1862. Thus, at the early age of 43, he stood next in rank to the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, and it was commonly, though erroneously, expected that he would in the end attain to that dignity also. It is a matter of temperament and belief whether you read this list with respect or with boredom, whether you look upon an archbishop's hat as a crown or as an extinguisher. If, like the present reviewer, you are ready to hold the simple faith that the outer order corresponds to the inner, that a vicar is a good man, a canon a better man, and an archbishop the best man of all, you will find the study of the archbishop's life one of extreme fascination. He has turned aside from poetry and philosophy and law and specialized in virtue. He has dedicated himself to the service of the divine. His spiritual proficiency has been such that he has developed from deacon to dean, from dean to bishop, and from bishop to archbishop in the short space of 20 years. As there are only 2 archbishops in the whole of England, the inference seems to be that he is the second best man in England. His hat is the proof of it. Even in a material sense, his hat was one of the largest. It was larger than Mr. Gladstone's, larger than Thackeray's, larger than Dickens. It was, in fact, so his hatter told him, and we are inclined to agree, an 8 full. Yet he began much as other men begin. He struck an undergraduate in a fit of temper, and was rusticated. He wrote a textbook of logic, and rode a very good oar. But after he was ordained, his diary shows that the specializing process had begun. He thought a great deal about the state of his soul, about the monstrous tumor of simony, about church reform, and about the meaning of Christianity. Self-renunciation, he came to the conclusion, is the foundation of Christian religion and Christian morals. The highest wisdom is that which can enforce and cultivate this self-renunciation. Hence, against cousin, I hold that religion is higher far than philosophy. There is one mention of chemists and capillarity, but science and philosophy were, even at this early stage, in danger of being crowded out. Soon the diary takes a different tone. He seems, says his biographer, to have had no time for committing his thoughts to paper. He records his engagements only, and he dines out almost every night. Sir Henry Taylor, whom he met at one of these parties, described him as simple, solid, good, capable, and pleasing. Perhaps it was his solidity, combined with his eminently scientific turn of mind, his blandness as well as his bulk, that impressed some of these great people with the confidence that in him the Church had found a very necessary champion. His brawny logic and massive frame seemed to fit him to grapple with a task that taxed the strongest, how, that is, to reconcile the scientific discoveries of the age with religion, and even prove them some of its strongest witnesses for the truth. If anyone could do this, Thomson could. His practical ability, unhampered by any mystical or dreaming tendency, had already proved itself in the conduct of the business affairs of his college. From bishop he became almost instantly archbishop, and in becoming archbishop he became primate of England, governor of the Charterhouse and King's College, London, patron of 120 livings, with the archdeaconries of York, Cleveland, and the East Riding in his gift, and the canonries and prebends in York Minster. Bishopthorpe itself was an enormous palace. He was immediately faced by the knotty question of whether to buy all the furniture, much of it only poor stuff, or to furnish the house anew, which would cost a fortune. Moreover, there were 7 cows in the park, but these perhaps were counterbalanced by 9 children in the nursery. Then the Prince and Princess of Wales came to stay, and the Archbishop took upon himself the task of furnishing the princess's apartments. He went up to London and bought 8 moderator lamps, 2 Spanish figures holding candles, and reminded himself of the necessity of buying soap for Princess. But meanwhile, far more serious matters claimed every ounce of his strength. Already he had been exhorted to wield the sure lance of your brawny logic against the sophistries of the authors of essays and reviews, and had responded in a work called Aids to Faith. Near at hand, the town of Sheffield, with its large population of imperfectly educated working men, was a breeding ground of skepticism and discontent. The Archbishop made it his special charge. He was fond of watching the rolling of armor plate, and constantly addressed meetings of working men. Now, what are these nihilisms and socialisms and communisms and Fenianisms and secret societies? What do they all mean? He asked. Selfishness, he replied, and assertion of one class against the rest is at the bottom of them all. There was a law of nature, he said, by which wages went up and wages went down. You must accept the declivity as well as the ascent. If we could only get people to learn that, then things would go on a great deal better and smoother. And the working men of Sheffield responded by giving him 500 pieces of cutlery mounted in sterling silver. But presumably there were a certain number of knives among the spoons and the forks. Bishop Colenso, however, was far more troublesome than the working men of Sheffield, and the ritualists vexed him so persistently that even his vast strength felt the strain. The questions which were referred to him for decision were peculiarly fitted to tease and annoy even a man of his bulk and his blandness. Shall a drunkard found dead in a ditch, or a burglar who has fallen through a skylight, be given the benefit of the burial service? He was asked. The question of lighted candles was most difficult. The wearing of colored stoles and the administration of the mixed chalice taxed him considerably. And finally there was the Reverend John Purchas, who, dressed in cope, alb, beretta, and stole crosswise, lit candles and extinguished them for no special reason, filled a vessel with black powder and rubbed it into the foreheads of his congregation, and hung over the holy table a figure, image, or stuffed skin of a dove in a flying attitude. The Archbishop's temper, usually so positive and imperturbable, was gravely ruffled. Will there ever come a time when it will be thought a crime to have striven to keep the Church of England as representing the common sense of the nation? He asked. I suppose it may, but I shall not see it. I have gone through a good deal, but I do not repent of having done my best. If, for a moment, the Archbishop himself could ask such a question, we must confess to a state of complete bewilderment. What has become of our superlatively good man? He is harassed and cumbered, spends his time settling questions about stuffed pigeons and colored petticoats, writes over 80 letters before breakfast sometimes, scarcely has time to run over to Paris and buy his daughter a bonnet, and in the end has to ask himself whether one of these days his conduct will not be considered a crime. Was it a crime? And if so, was it his fault? Did he not start out in the belief that Christianity had something to do with renunciation, and was not entirely a matter of common sense? If honors and obligations, pomps and possessions accumulated and encrusted him, how, being an archbishop, could he refuse to accept them? Princesses must have their soap, palaces must have their furniture, children must have their cows, and, pathetic though it seems, he never completely lost his interest in science. He wore a pedometer. He was one of the first to use a camera. He believed in the future of the typewriter, and in his last years he tried to mend a broken clock. He was a delightful father, too. He wrote witty, terse, sensible letters. His good stories were much to the point, and he died in harness. Certainly he was a very able man, but if we insist upon goodness, is it easy, is it possible for a good man to be an archbishop? End of section 23.
Section 24 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. The Patron and the Crocus. Young men and women beginning to write are generally given the plausible, but utterly impracticable, advice to write what they have to write as shortly as possible, as clearly as possible, and without other thought in their minds except to say exactly what is in them. Nobody ever adds on these occasions the one thing needful. And be sure you choose your patron wisely. though that is the gist of the whole matter. For a book is always written for somebody to read. And, since the patron is not merely the paymaster, but also in a very subtle and insidious way, the instigator and inspirer of what is written, it is of the utmost importance that he should be a desirable man. But who, then, is the desirable man? The patron who will cajole the best out of the writer's brain and bring to birth the most varied and vigorous progeny of which he is capable? Different ages have answered the question differently. The Elizabethans, to speak roughly, chose the aristocracy to write for and the playhouse public. The 18th century patron was a combination of coffee-house wit and Grub Street bookseller. In the 19th century, the great writers wrote for the half-crown magazines and the leisured classes. And looking back and applauding the splendid results of these different alliances, it all seems enviably simple and plain as a pikestaff, compared with our own predicament. For whom should we write? For the present supply of patrons is of unexampled and bewildering variety. There is the daily press, the weekly press, the monthly press, the English public and the American public, the bestseller public and the worst-seller public, the highbrow public and the red-blood public, all now organized, self-conscious entities capable, through their various mouthpieces, of making their needs known and their approval or displeasure felt. Thus the writer who has been moved by the sight of the first crocus in Kensington Gardens has, before he sets pen to paper, to choose from a crowd of competitors the particular patron who suits him best. It is futile to say, dismiss them all, think only of your crocus, because writing is a method of communication, and the crocus is an imperfect crocus until it has been shared. The first man, or the last, may write for himself alone, but he is an exception, and an unenviable one at that, and the gulls are welcome to his works, if the gulls can read them. Granted, then, that every writer has some public or other at the end of his pen. The high-minded will say that it should be a submissive public, accepting obediently whatever he likes to give it. Plausible as the theory sounds, great risks are attached to it, for in that case, the writer remains conscious of his public, yet is superior to it. An uncomfortable and unfortunate combination, as the works of Samuel Butler, George Meredith, and Henry James may be taken to prove. Each despised the public, each desired a public, each failed to attain a public, and each wreaked his failure upon the public by a succession, gradually increasing in intensity, of angularities, obscurities, and affectations which no writer, whose patron was his equal and friend, would have thought it necessary to inflict. Their crocuses, in consequence, are tortured plants, beautiful and bright, but with something wry-necked about them, malformed, shriveled on the one side, overblown on the other. A touch of the sun would have done them a world of good. Shall we then rush to the opposite extreme, and accept, if in fancy alone, the flattering proposals which the editors of the Times and the Daily News may be supposed to make us? £20 down for your crocus in precisely 1,500 words, which shall blossom upon every breakfast table from John O'Groats to the Land's End before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, with the writer's name attached. But will one crocus be enough? And must it not be a very brilliant yellow, to shine so far, to cost so much, and to have one's name attached to it? The press is undoubtedly a great multiplier of crocuses, but if we look at some of those plants, we shall find that they are only very distantly related to the original little yellow or purple flower, which pokes up through the grass in Kensington Gardens about this time of year. The newspaper crocus is amazing, but still a very different plant. It fills precisely the space allotted to it. It radiates a golden glow. It is genial, affable, warm-hearted. It is beautifully finished, too, for let nobody think that the art of our dramatic critic of the Times, or of Mr. Lind of the Daily News, is an easy one. It is no despicable feat to start 1,000,000 brains running at 9 o'clock in the morning, to give 2,000,000 eyes something bright and brisk and amusing to look at. But the night comes, and these flowers fade. So little bits of glass lose their luster if you take them out of the sea. Great prima donnas howl like hyenas if you shut them up in telephone boxes, and the most brilliant of articles, when removed from its element, is dust and sand and the husks of straw. Journalism, embalmed in a book, is unreadable. The patron we want, then, is one who will help us to preserve our flowers from decay. But as his qualities change from age to age, and it needs considerable integrity and conviction not to be dazzled by the pretensions or bamboozled by the persuasions of the competing crowd, this business of patron-finding is one of the tests and trials of authorship. To know whom to write for is to know how to write. Some of the modern patron's qualities are, however, fairly plain. The writer will require, at this moment, it is obvious, a patron with a book-reading habit rather than the play-going habit. Nowadays, too, he must be instructed in the literature of other times and races. But there are other qualities which our special weaknesses and tendencies demand in him. There is the question of indecency, for instance, which plagues us and puzzles us, much more than it did the Elizabethans. The 20th century patron must be immune from shock. He must distinguish infallibly between the little clod of manure which sticks to the crocus of necessity and that which is plastered to it out of bravado. He must be a judge, too, of those social influences which inevitably play so large a part in modern literature, and able to say which matures and fortifies, which inhibits and makes sterile. Further, there is emotion for him to pounce on, and in no department can he do more useful work than in bracing a writer against sentimentality on the one hand, and a craven fear of expressing his feeling on the other. It is worse, he will say, and perhaps more common, to be afraid of feeling than to feel too much. He will add, perhaps, something about language, and point out how many words Shakespeare used, and how much grammar Shakespeare violated, while we, though we keep our fingers so demurely to the black notes on the piano, have not appreciably improved upon Antony and Cleopatra. And if you can forget your sex altogether, he will say, so much the better. A writer has none. But all this is, by the way, elementary and disputable. The patron's prime quality is something different, only to be expressed, perhaps, by the use of that convenient word which cloaks so much, atmosphere. It is necessary that the patron should shed and envelop the crocus in an atmosphere which makes it appear a plant of the very highest importance, so that to misrepresent it is the one outrage not to be forgiven this side of the grave. He must make us feel that a single crocus, if it be a real crocus, is enough for him, that he does not want to be lectured, elevated, instructed, or improved, that he is sorry that he bullied Carlyle into vociferation, Tennyson into idyllics, and Ruskin into insanity, that he is now ready to efface himself, or assert himself, as his writers require, that he is bound to them by a more than maternal tie, that they are twins indeed, one dying if the other dies, one flourishing if the other flourishes, that the fate of literature depends upon their happy alliance, all of which proves, as we began by saying, that the choice of a patron is of the highest importance. But how to choose rightly? How to write well? Those are the questions. End of section 24. Recording by Olivia.
Section 25 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Arden. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. The Modern Essay. As Mr. Rees truly says, it is unnecessary to go profoundly into the history and origin of the essay, whether it derives from Socrates or Sarani the Persian, since, like all living things, its present is more important than its past. Moreover, the family is widely spread, and while some of its representatives have risen in the world and wear their coronets with the best, others pick up a precarious living in the gutter near Fleet Street. The form, too, admits variety. The essay can be short or long, serious or trifling, about God and Spinoza, or about turtles in Cheapside. But as we turn over the pages of these 5 little volumes, containing essays written between 1817 and 1920, certain principles appear to control the chaos, and we detect in the short period under review something like the progress of history. Of all forms of literature, however, the essay is the one which least calls for the use of long words. The principle which controls it is simply that it should give pleasure. The desire which impels us when we take it from the shelf is simply to receive pleasure. Everything in an essay must be subdued to that end. It should lay us under a spell with its first word, and we should only wake, refreshed, with its last. In the interval we may pass through the most various experiences of amusement, surprise, interest, indignation. We may soar to the heights of fantasy with Lamb, or plunge to the depths of wisdom with Bacon, but we must never be roused. The essay must lap us about and draw its curtain across the world. So great a feat is seldom accomplished, though the fault may well be as much on the reader's side as on the writer's. Habit and lethargy have dulled his palate. A novel has a story, a poem rhyme, but what art can the essayist use in these short lengths of prose to sting us wide awake and fix us in a trance which is not sleep, but rather an intensification of life, a basking, with every faculty alert, in the sun of pleasure? He must know, that is the first essential, how to write. His learning may be as profound as Mark Patterson's, but in an essay it must be so fused by the magic of writing that not a fact juts out, not a dogma tears the surface of the texture. Macaulay in one way, Froude in another, did this superbly over and over again. They have blown more knowledge into us in the course of one essay than the innumerable chapters of 100 textbooks. But when Mark Patterson has to tell us, in the space of 35 little pages, about Montaigne, we feel that he had not previously assimilated M. Grun. M. Grun was a gentleman who once wrote a bad book. M. Grun and his book should have been embalmed for our perpetual delight in amber. But the process is fatiguing. It requires more time, and perhaps more temper, than Patterson had at his command. He served M. Grun up raw, and he remains a crude berry among the cook meats, upon which our teeth must grate forever. Something of the sort applies to Matthew Arnold and a certain translator of Spinoza. Literal truth-telling and finding fault with a culprit for his good are out of place in an essay, where everything should be for our good, and rather for eternity, than for the March number of the Fortnightly Review. But if the voice of the scold should never be heard in this narrow plot, there is another voice which is as a plague of locusts, the voice of a man stumbling drowsily among loose words, clutching aimlessly at vague ideas. The voice, for example, of Mr. Hutton in the following passage. Add to this that his married life was very brief, only 7 years and a half, being unexpectedly cut short, and that his passionate reverence for his wife's memory and genius, in his own words, a religion, was one which, as he must have been perfectly sensible, he could not make to appear otherwise than extravagant, not to say an hallucination, in the eyes of the rest of mankind, and yet that he was possessed by an irresistible yearning to attempt to embody it in all the tender and enthusiastic hyperbole, of which it is so pathetic to find a man who gained his fame by his dry light a master. And it is impossible not to feel that the human incidents in Mr. Mill's career are very sad. A book could take that blow, but it sinks an essay. A biography in 2 volumes is indeed the proper depositary, for there, where the license is so much wider, and hints and glimpses of outside things make part of the feast, we refer to the old type of Victorian volume. These yawns and stretches hardly matter, and have indeed some positive value of their own. But that value, which is contributed by the reader, perhaps illicitly, in his desire to get as much into the book from all possible sources as he can, must be ruled out here. There is no room for the impurities of literature in an essay. Somehow or other, by dint of labor or bounty of nature, or both combined, the essay must be pure, pure like water, or pure like wine, but pure from dullness, deadness, and deposits of extraneous matter. Of all writers in the first volume, Walter Pater best achieves this arduous task, because before setting out to write his essay, Notes on Leonardo da Vinci, he has somehow contrived to get his material fused. He is a learned man, but it is not knowledge of Leonardo that remains with us, but a vision, such as we get in a good novel, where everything contributes to bring the writer's conception as a whole before us. Only here, in the essay, where the bounds are so strict and facts have to be used in their nakedness, the true writer, like Walter Pater, makes these limitations yield their own quality. Truth will give it authority. From its narrow limits he will get shape and intensity. And then there is no more fitting place for some of those ornaments which the old writers loved, and we, by calling them ornaments, presumably despise. Nowadays, nobody would have the courage to embark on the once famous description of Leonardo's lady, who has learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen day about her, and trafficked for strange webs with eastern merchants, and as Leda was the mother of Helen of Troy, and as Saint Anne, the mother of Mary. The passage is too thumb-marked to slip naturally into the context, but when we come unexpectedly upon the smiling of women and the motion of great waters, or upon full of the refinement of the dead, in sad, earth-colored raiment, set with pale stones, we suddenly remember that we have ears and we have eyes, and that the English language fills a long array of stout volumes with innumerable words, many of which are of more than one syllable. The only living Englishman who ever looks into these volumes is, of course, a gentleman of Polish extraction, but doubtless our abstention saves us much gush, much rhetoric, much high-stepping and cloud-prancing, and for the sake of the prevailing sobriety and hard-headedness, we should be willing to barter the splendor of Sir Thomas Browne and the vigor of Swift. Yet, if the essay admits more properly than biography or fiction of sudden boldness and metaphor, and can be polished till every atom of its surface shines, there are dangers in that too. We are soon in sight of ornament. Soon the current, which is the life-blood of literature, runs slow, and instead of sparkling and flashing or moving with a quieter impulse, which has a deeper excitement, words coagulate together in frozen sprays, which, like the grapes on a Christmas tree, glitter for a single night, but are dusty and garish the day after. The temptation to decorate is great where the theme may be of the slightest. What is there to interest another in the fact that one has enjoyed a walking tour, or has amused oneself by rambling down Cheapside and looking at the turtles in Mr. Sweeting's shop window? Stevenson and Samuel Butler chose very different methods of exciting our interest in these domestic themes. Stevenson, of course, trimmed and polished and set out his matter in the traditional 18th century form. It is admirably done, but we cannot help feeling anxious, as the essay proceeds, lest the material may give out under the craftsman's fingers. The ingot is so small, the manipulation so incessant, and perhaps that is why the peroration. To sit still and contemplate, to remember the faces of women without desire, to be pleased by the great deeds of men without envy, to be everything and everywhere in sympathy, and yet content to remain where and what you are, has the sort of insubstantiality which suggests that by the time he got to the end, he had left himself nothing solid to work with. Butler adopted the very opposite method. Think your own thoughts, he seems to say, and speak them as plainly as you can. These turtles in the shop window, which appear to leak out of their shells through heads and feet, suggest a fatal faithfulness to a fixed idea. And so, striding unconcernedly from one idea to the next, we traverse a large stretch of ground. Observe that a wound in the solicitor is a very serious thing, that Mary Queen of Scots wears surgical boots and is subject to fits near the Horseshoe in Tottenham Court Road. Take it for granted that no one really cares about Aeschylus, and so, with many amusing anecdotes and some profound reflections, reach the peroration, which is that, as he had been told not to see more in Cheapside than he could get into 12 pages of the Universal Review, he had better stop. And yet obviously Butler is at least as careful of our pleasure as Stevenson, and to write like oneself and call it not writing is a much harder exercise in style than to write like Addison and call it writing well. But, however much they differ individually, the Victorian essayists yet had something in common. They wrote at greater length than is now usual, and they wrote for a public which had not only time to sit down to its magazine seriously, but a high, if peculiarly Victorian, standard of culture by which to judge it. It was worthwhile to speak out upon serious matters in an essay, and there was nothing absurd in writing as well as one possibly could when, in a month or two, the same public which had welcomed the essay in a magazine would carefully read it once more in a book. But a change came from a small audience of cultivated people to a larger audience of people who were not quite so cultivated. The change was not altogether for the worse. In Volume 3, we find Mr. Birrell and Mr. Beerbohm. It might even be said that there was a reversion to the classic type, and that the essay, by losing its size and something of its sonority, was approaching more nearly the essay of Addison and Lamb. At any rate, There is a great gulf between Mr. Birrell on Carlyle and the essay which one may suppose that Carlyle would have written upon Mr. Birrell. There is little similarity between A Cloud of Pinafores by Max Beerbohm and A Cynic's Apology by Leslie Stephen. But the essay is alive. There is no reason to despair. As the conditions change, so the essayist, most sensitive of all plants to public opinion, adapts himself, and if he is good, makes the best of the change, and if he is bad, the worst. Mr. Birrell is certainly good, and so we find that, though he has dropped a considerable amount of weight, his attack is much more direct and his movement more supple. But what did Mr. Beerbohm give to the essay, and what did he take from it? That is a much more complicated question, for here we have an essayist who has concentrated on the work and is without doubt the prince of his profession. What Mr. Beerbohm gave was, of course, himself. This presence, which has haunted the essay fitfully from the time of Montaigne, had been in exile since the death of Charles Lamb. Matthew Arnold was never to his readers Matt, nor Walter Pater affectionately abbreviated in 1,000 Homes to Watt. They gave us much, but that they did not give. Thus, sometime in the 90s, it must have surprised readers accustomed to exhortation, information, and denunciation to find themselves familiarly addressed by a voice which seemed to belong to a man no larger than themselves. He was affected by private joys and sorrows, and had no gospel to preach, and no learning to impart. He was himself, simply and directly, and himself he has remained. Once again we have an essayist capable of using the essayist's most proper but most dangerous and delicate tool. He has brought personality into literature, not unconsciously and impurely, but so consciously and purely that we do not know whether there is any relation between Max the essayist and Mr. Beerbohm the man. We only know that the spirit of personality permeates every word that he writes. The triumph is the triumph of style, for it is only by knowing how to write that you can make use in literature of yourself, that self which, while it is essential to literature, is also its most dangerous antagonist. Never to be yourself, and yet always, that is the problem. Some of the essayists in Mr. Rees's collection, to be frank, have not altogether succeeded in solving it. We are nauseated by the sight of trivial personalities decomposing in the eternity of print. As talk, no doubt, it was charming, and certainly the writer is a good fellow to meet over a bottle of beer. But literature is stern. It is no use being charming, virtuous, or even learned and brilliant into the bargain, unless, she seems to reiterate, you fulfill her first condition, to know how to write. This art is possessed to perfection by Mr. Beerbohm, but he has not searched the dictionary for polysyllables. He has not molded firm periods, or seduced our ears with intricate cadences and strange melodies. Some of his companions, Henley and Stevenson, for example, are momentarily more impressive. But A Cloud of Pinafores had in it that indescribable inequality, stir, and final expressiveness which belong to life, and to life alone. You have not finished with it because you have read it, any more than friendship is ended because it is time to part. Life wells up and alters and adds. Even things in a bookcase change if they are alive. We find ourselves wanting to meet them again. We find them altered. So we look back upon essay after essay by Mr. Beerbohm, knowing that, come September or May, we shall sit down with them and talk. Yet it is true that the essayist is the most sensitive of all writers to public opinion. The drawing room is the place where a great deal of reading is done nowadays, and the essays of Mr. Beerbohm lie, with an exquisite appreciation of all that the position exacts, upon the drawing room table. There is no gin about, no strong tobacco, no puns, drunkenness, or insanity. Ladies and gentlemen talk together, and some things, of course, are not said. But if it would be foolish to attempt to confine Mr. Beerbohm to one room, it would be still more foolish, unhappily, to make him, the artist, the man who gives us only his best, the representative of our age. There are no essays by Mr. Beerbohm in the 4th or 5th volumes of the present collection. His age seems already a little distant, and the drawing-room table, as it recedes, begins to look rather like an altar, where, once upon a time, people deposited offerings, fruit from their own orchards, gifts carved with their own hands. Now once more the conditions have changed. The public needs essays as much as ever, and perhaps even more. The demand for the light middle not exceeding 1,500 words, or in special cases 1,750, much exceeds the supply. Where Lamb wrote one essay, and Max perhaps writes two, Mr. Belloc, at a rough computation, produces 365. They are very short, it is true. Yet with what dexterity the practiced essayist will utilize his space, beginning as close to the top of the sheet as possible, judging precisely how far to go, when to turn, and how, without sacrificing a hair's breadth of paper, to wheel about and alight accurately upon the last word his editor allows. As a feat of skill, it is well worth watching. But the personality upon which Mr. Belloc, like Mr. Beerbohm, depends, suffers in the process. It comes to us not with the natural richness of the speaking voice, but strained and thin, and full of mannerisms and affectations, like the voice of a man shouting through a megaphone to a crowd on a windy day. Little friends, my readers, he says in the essay called An Unknown Country, and he goes on to tell us how there was a shepherd the other day at Findon Fair, who had come from the east by Lewes with sheep, and who had in his eyes that reminiscence of horizons which makes the eyes of shepherds and of mountaineers different from the eyes of other men. I went with him to hear what he had to say, for shepherds talk quite differently from other men. Happily this shepherd had little to say, even under the stimulus of the inevitable mug of beer, about the unknown country, for the only remark that he did make proves him either a minor poet, unfit for the care of sheep, or Mr. Belloc himself masquerading with a fountain pen. That is the penalty which the habitual essayist must now be prepared to face. He must masquerade. He cannot afford the time either to be himself or to be other people. He must skim the surface of thought and dilute the strength of personality. He must give us a worn weekly halfpenny instead of a solid sovereign once a year. But it is not Mr. Belloc only who has suffered from the prevailing conditions. The essays which bring the collection to the year 1920 may not be the best of their author's work, but if we accept writers like Mr. Conrad and Mr. Hudson, who have strayed into essay writing accidentally, and concentrate upon those who write essays habitually, we shall find them a good deal affected by the change in their circumstances. To write weekly, to write daily, to write shortly, to write for busy people catching trains in the morning, or for tired people coming home in the evening, is a heart-breaking task for men who know good writing from bad. They do it, but instinctively draw out of harm's way anything precious that might be damaged by contact with the public, or anything sharp that might irritate its skin. And so, if one reads Mr. Lucas, Mr. Lind, or Mr. Squire in the bulk, one feels that a common grayness silvers everything. They are as far removed from the extravagant beauty of Walter Pater as they are from the intemperate candor of Leslie Stephen. Beauty and courage are dangerous spirits to battle in a column and a half, and thought, like a brown paper parcel in a waistcoat pocket, has a way of spoiling the symmetry of an article. It is a kind, tired, apathetic world for which they write, and the marvel is that they never cease to attempt, at least, to write well. But there is no need to pity Mr. Clutton Brock for this change in the essayist's conditions. He has clearly made the best of his circumstances, and not the worst. One hesitates even to say that he has had to make any conscious effort in the matter, so naturally has he effected the transition from the private essayist to the public, from the drawing room to the Albert Hall. Paradoxically enough, the shrinkage in size has brought about a corresponding expansion of individuality. We have no longer the I of Max and of Lamb, but the we of public bodies and other sublime personages. It is we who go to hear the magic flute, we who ought to profit by it, we, in some mysterious way, who, in our corporate capacity, once upon a time actually wrote it. For music and literature and art must submit to the same generalization, or they will not carry to the farthest recesses of the Albert Hall. That the voice of Mr. Clutton Brock, so sincere and so disinterested, carries such a distance, and reaches so many, without pandering to the weakness of the mass or its passions, must be a matter of legitimate satisfaction to us all. But while we are gratified, I, that unruly partner in the human fellowship, is reduced to despair. I must always think things for himself, and feel things for himself. To share them in a diluted form with the majority of well-educated and well-intentioned men and women is for him sheer agony, and while the rest of us listen intently and profit profoundly, I slips off to the woods and the fields and rejoices in a single blade of grass or a solitary potato. In the 5th volume of Modern Essays, it seems, we have got some way from pleasure and the art of writing. But in justice to the essayists of 1920, we must be sure that we are not praising the famous because they have been praised already, and the dead because we shall never meet them wearing spats in Piccadilly. We must know what we mean when we say that they can write and give us pleasure. We must compare them. We must bring out the quality. We must point to this and say it is good because it is exact, truthful, and imaginative. Nay, retired men cannot when they would, neither will they, when it were reason, but are impatient of privateness, even in age and sickness, which require the shadow, like old townsmen, that will still be sitting at their street door, though thereby they offer age to scorn, and to this, and say it is bad, because it is loose, plausible, and commonplace. With courteous and precise cynicism on his lips, he thought of quiet virginal chambers, of water singing under the moon, of terraces where taintless music sobbed into the open night, of pure maternal mistresses with protecting arms and vigilant eyes, of fields slumbering in the sunlight, of leagues of ocean heaving under warm tremulous heavens, of hot ports, gorgeous and perfumed. It goes on, but already we are bemused with sound and neither feel nor hear. The comparison makes us suspect that the art of writing has for backbone some fierce attachment to an idea. It is on the back of an idea, something believed in with conviction, or seen with precision, and thus compelling words to its shape, that the divers company which included Lamb and Bacon, and Mr. Beerbohm and Hudson, and Vernon Lee, and Mr. Conrad, and Leslie Stephen, and Butler, and Walter Pater, reaches the farther shore. Very various talents have helped or hindered the passage of the idea into words. Some scrape through painfully, others fly with every wind favoring. But Mr. Belloc, and Mr. Lucas, and Mr. Lind, and Mr. Squire are not fiercely attached to anything in itself. They share the contemporary dilemma, that lack of an obstinate conviction, which lifts ephemeral sounds through the misty sphere of anybody's language to the land where there is a perpetual marriage, a perpetual union. Vague as all definitions are, a good essay must have this permanent quality about it. It must draw its curtain round us, but it must be a curtain that shuts us in, not out. End of section 25.
Section 26 of the Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. Joseph Conrad. Suddenly, without giving us time to arrange our thoughts or prepare our phrases, our guest has left us, and his withdrawal without farewell or ceremony is in keeping with his mysterious arrival long years ago to take up his lodging in this country. For there was always an air of mystery about him. It was partly his Polish birth, partly his memorable appearance, partly his preference for living in the depths of the country, out of earshot of gossips, beyond reach of hostesses, so that for news of him one had to depend upon the evidence of simple visitors with a habit of ringing doorbells, who reported of their unknown host that he had the most perfect manners, the brightest eyes, and spoke English with a strong foreign accent. Still, though it is the habit of death to quicken and focus our memories, there clings to the genius of Conrad something essentially and not accidentally difficult of approach. His reputation of later years was, with one obvious exception, undoubtedly the highest in England. Yet he was not popular. He was read with passionate delight by some. Others he left cold and lustreless. Among his readers were people of the most opposite ages and sympathies. Schoolboys of 14, driving their way through Marryat, Scott, Henty, and Dickens swallowed him down with the rest, while the seasoned and the fastidious, who in process of time have eaten their way to the heart of literature, and there turn over and over a few precious crumbs, set Conrad scrupulously upon their banqueting table. One source of difficulty and disagreement is, of course, to be found, where men have at all times found it, in his beauty. One opens his pages and feels as Helen must have felt when she looked in her glass and realized that, do what she would, she could never in any circumstances pass for a plain woman. So Conrad had been gifted, so he had schooled himself, and such was his obligation to a strange language, wooed characteristically for its Latin qualities rather than its Saxon, that it seemed impossible for him to make an ugly or insignificant movement of the pen. His mistress, his style, is a little somnolent sometimes in repose. But let somebody speak to her, and then how magnificently she bears down upon us, with what color, triumph, and majesty! Yet it is arguable that Conrad would have gained both in credit and in popularity if he had written what he had to write without this incessant care for appearances. They block and impede and distract, his critics say, pointing to those famous passages which it is becoming the habit to lift from their context and exhibit among other cut flowers of English prose. He was self-conscious and stiff and ornate, they complain, and the sound of his own voice was dearer to him than the voice of humanity in its anguish. The criticism is familiar, and as difficult to refute as the remarks of deaf people when Figaro is played. They see the orchestra; far off they hear a dismal scrape of sound. Their own remarks are interrupted, and, very naturally, they conclude that the ends of life would be better served if, instead of scraping Mozart, those 50 fiddlers broke stones upon the road. That beauty teaches, that beauty is a disciplinarian, how are we to convince them, since her teaching is inseparable from the sound of her voice, and to that they are deaf? But read Conrad, not in birthday books, but in the bulk, and he must be lost indeed to the meaning of words who does not hear in that rather stiff and somber music, with its reserve, its pride, its vast and implacable integrity, how it is better to be good than bad, how loyalty is good, and honesty and courage, though ostensibly Conrad is concerned merely to show us the beauty of a night at sea. But it is ill work dragging such intimations from their element. Dried in our little saucers, without the magic and mystery of language, they lose their power to excite and goad. They lose the drastic power which is a constant quality of Conrad's prose. For it was by virtue of something drastic in him, the qualities of a leader and captain, that Conrad kept his hold over boys and young people. Until Nostromo was written, his characters, as the young were quick to perceive, were fundamentally simple and heroic, however subtle the mind and indirect the method of their creator. They were seafarers, used to solitude and silence. They were in conflict with nature, but at peace with man. Nature was their antagonist. She it was who drew forth honor, magnanimity, loyalty, the qualities proper to man. She who in sheltered bays reared to womanhood beautiful girls, unfathomable and austere. above all, it was nature who turned out such gnarled and tested characters as Captain Whalley and old Singleton, obscure but glorious in their obscurity, who were to Conrad the pick of our race, the men whose praises he was never tired of celebrating. They had been strong, as those are strong who know neither doubts nor hopes. They had been impatient and enduring, turbulent and devoted, unruly and faithful. Well-meaning people had tried to represent these men as whining over every mouthful of their food, as going about their work in fear of their lives. But in truth they had been men who knew toil, privation, violence, debauchery, but knew not fear, and had no desire of spite in their hearts. Men hard to manage, but easy to inspire. Voiceless men, but men enough to scorn in their hearts the sentimental voices that bewailed the hardness of their fate. It was a fate unique and their own. The capacity to bear it appeared to them the privilege of the chosen. Their generation lived inarticulate and indispensable, without knowing the sweetness of affections or the refuge of a home, and died free from the dark menace of a narrow grave. They were the everlasting children of the mysterious sea. Such were the characters of the early books: Lord Jim, Typhoon, the nigger of the Narcissus, Youth. And these books, in spite of the changes and fashions, are surely secure of their place among our classics. But they reach this height by means of qualities which the simple story of adventure, as Marryat told it, or Fenimore Cooper, has no claim to possess. For it is clear that to admire and celebrate such men and such deeds romantically, wholeheartedly, and with the fervor of a lover, one must be possessed of the double vision. One must be at once inside and out. To praise their silence, one must possess a voice. To appreciate their endurance, one must be sensitive to fatigue. One must be able to live on equal terms with the Whaleys and the Singletons, and yet hide from their suspicious eyes the very qualities which enable one to understand them. Conrad alone was able to live that double life, for Conrad was compound of two men. Together with the sea captain dwelt that subtle, refined, and fastidious analyst whom he called Marlowe. A most discreet, understanding man, he said of Marlowe. Marlowe was one of those born observers who are happiest in retirement. Marlowe liked nothing better than to sit on deck in some obscure creek of the Thames, smoking and recollecting, smoking and speculating, sending after his smoke beautiful rings of words, until all the summer's night became a little clouded with tobacco smoke. Marlowe, too, had a profound respect for the men with whom he had sailed, but he saw the humor of them. He nosed out and described in masterly fashion those livid creatures who prey successfully upon the clumsy veterans. He had a flair for human deformity. His humor was sardonic. Nor did Marlowe live entirely wreathed in the smoke of his own cigars. He had a habit of opening his eyes suddenly and looking at a rubbish heap, at a port, at a shop counter, and then, complete in its burning ring of light, that thing is flashed bright upon the mysterious background. Introspective and analytical, Marlowe was aware of this peculiarity. He said the power came to him suddenly. He might, for instance, overhear a French officer murmur, "Mon Dieu, how the time passes!" Nothing, he comments, could have been more commonplace than this remark, but its utterance coincided for me with a moment of vision. It's extraordinary how we go through life with eyes half shut, with dull ears, with dormant thoughts. Nevertheless, there can be but few of us who had never known one of these rare moments of awakening, when we see, hear, understand ever so much everything in a flash, before we fall back again into our agreeable somnolence. I raised my eyes when he spoke, and I saw him as though I had never seen him before. Picture after picture he painted thus upon that dark background, ships first and foremost, ships at anchor, ships flying before the storm, ships in harbor. He painted sunsets and dawns, he painted the night, he painted the sea in every aspect. He painted the gaudy brilliancy of eastern ports, of men and women, their houses and their attitudes. He was an accurate and unflinching observer, schooled to that absolute loyalty towards his feelings and sensations, which, Conrad wrote, an author should keep hold of in his most exalted moments of creation. And very quietly and compassionately Marlowe sometimes lets fall a few words of epitaph, which remind us, with all that beauty and brilliancy before our eyes, of the darkness of the background. Thus, a rough and ready distinction would make us say that it is Marlowe who comments, Conrad who creates. It would lead us, aware that we are on dangerous ground, to account for that change which, Conrad tells us, took place when he had finished the last story in the Typhoon volume. A subtle change in the nature of the inspiration, by some alteration in the relationship of the two old friends. It seemed somehow that there was nothing more in the world to write about. It was Conrad, let us suppose, Conrad the creator, who said that, looking back with sorrowful satisfaction upon the stories he had told, feeling as he well might that he could never better the storm in The Nigger of the Narcissus, or render more faithful tribute to the qualities of British seamen than he had done already in Youth and Lord Jim. It was then that Marlowe, the commentator, reminded him how, in the course of nature, one must grow old, sit smoking on deck, and give up seafaring. But, he reminded him, those strenuous years had deposited their memories, and he even went so far perhaps as to hint that, though the last word might have been said about Captain Whalley and his relation to the universe, there remained on shore a number of men and women whose relationships, though of a more personal kind, might be worth looking into. If we further suppose that there was a volume of Henry James on board, and that Marlowe gave his friend the book to take to bed with him, we may seek support in the fact that it was in 1905 that Conrad wrote a very fine essay upon that master. For some years, then, it was Marlowe who was the dominant partner. Nostromo, Chance, the Arrow of Gold represent that stage of the alliance which some will continue to find the richest of all. The human heart is more intricate than the forest, they will say. It has its storms, it has its creatures of the night, and if as novelist you wish to test man in all his relationships, the proper antagonist is man. His ordeal is in society, not solitude. For them there will always be a peculiar fascination in the books where the light of those brilliant eyes falls not only upon the waste of waters, but upon the heart in its perplexity. But it must be admitted that, if Marlowe thus advised Conrad to shift his angle of vision, the advice was bold. For the vision of a novelist is both complex and specialized. Complex because behind his characters, and apart from them, must stand something stable to which he relates them. Specialized because, since he is a single person with one sensibility, the aspects of life in which he can believe with conviction are strictly limited. So delicate a balance is easily disturbed. After the middle period, Conrad never again was able to bring his figures into perfect relation with their background. He never believed in his later and more highly sophisticated characters as he had believed in his early seamen. When he had to indicate their relation to that other unseen world of novelists, the world of values and convictions, he was far less sure what those values were. Then, over and over again, a single phrase, "He steered with care," coming at the end of a storm, carried in it a whole morality. But in this more crowded and complicated world, such terse phrases became less and less appropriate. Complex men and women of many interests and relations would not submit to so summary a judgment, or if they did, much that was important in them escaped the verdict. And yet it was very necessary to Conrad's genius, with its luxuriant and romantic power, to have some law by which its creations could be tried. Essentially, such remained his creed, this world of civilized and self-conscious people is based upon a few very simple ideas. But where in the world of thoughts and personal relations are we to find them? There are no masks in drawing rooms. The typhoon does not test the worth of politicians and business men. Seeking and not finding such supports, the world of Conrad's later period has about it an involuntary obscurity, an inconclusiveness, almost a disillusionment, which baffles and fatigues. We lay hold in the dusk only of the old nobilities and sonorities. Fidelity, compassion, honor, service, beautiful always, but now a little wearily reiterated, as if times had changed. Perhaps it was Marlowe who was at fault. His habit of mind was a trifle sedentary. He had sat upon deck too long, splendid in soliloquy. He was less apt in the give and take of conversation, and those moments of vision, flashing and fading, do not serve as well as steady lamplight to illumine the ripple of life and its long, gradual years. Above all, perhaps, he did not take into account how, if Conrad was to create, it was essential first that he should believe. Therefore, though we shall make expeditions into the later books and bring back wonderful trophies, large tracts of them will remain by most of us untrodden. It is the earlier books, Youth, Lord Jim, Typhoon, The Nigger of the Narcissus, that we shall read in their entirety. For when the question is asked, what of Conrad will survive, and where in the ranks of novelists we are to place him, these books, with their air of telling us something very old and perfectly true, which had lain hidden but is now revealed, will come to mind and make such questions and comparisons seem a little futile. Complete and still, very chaste, and very beautiful, they rise in the memory as on these hot summer nights, in their slow and stately way, first one star comes out and then another. End of section 26.
Section 27 of The Common Reader. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf. How it strikes a contemporary. In the first place, a contemporary can scarcely fail to be struck by the fact that two critics at the same table, at the same moment, will pronounce completely different opinions about the same book. Here, on the right, it is declared a masterpiece of English prose. On the left, simultaneously, a mere mass of waste paper, which, if the fire could survive it, should be thrown upon the flames. Yet, both critics are in agreement about Milton and about Keats. They display an exquisite sensibility, and have undoubtedly a genuine enthusiasm. It is only when they discuss the work of contemporary writers that they inevitably come to blows. The book in question, which is at once a lasting contribution to English literature and a mere farrago of pretentious mediocrity, was published about 2 months ago. That is the explanation. That is why they differ. The explanation is a strange one. It is equally disconcerting to the reader who wishes to take his bearings in the chaos of contemporary literature, and to the writer who has a natural desire to know whether his own work, produced with infinite pains and in almost utter darkness, is likely to burn forever among the fixed luminaries of English letters, or, on the contrary, to put out the fire. But if we identify ourselves with the reader and explore his dilemma first, our bewilderment is short-lived enough. The same thing has happened so often before. We have heard the doctors disagreeing about the new and agreeing about the old twice a year on the average, in spring and autumn, ever since Robert Elsmere, or was it Stephen Phillips, somehow pervaded the atmosphere, and there was the same disagreement among grown-up people about them. It would be much more marvelous, and indeed much more upsetting, if, for a wonder, both gentlemen agreed, pronounced Blank's book an undoubted masterpiece, and thus faced us with the necessity of deciding whether we should back their judgment to the extent of 10 and 6 pence. Both are critics of reputation. The opinions tumbled out so spontaneously here will be starched and stiffened into columns of sober prose, which will uphold the dignity of letters in England and America. It must be some innate cynicism, then, some ungenerous distrust of contemporary genius, which determines us automatically, as the talk goes on, that, were they to agree, which they show no signs of doing, half a guinea is altogether too large a sum to squander upon contemporary enthusiasms, and the case will be met quite adequately by a card to the library. Still the question remains, and let us put it boldly to the critics themselves. Is there no guidance nowadays for a reader who yields to none in reverence for the dead, but is tormented by the suspicion that reverence for the dead is vitally connected with understanding of the living? After a rapid survey, both critics are agreed that there is unfortunately no such person. For what is their own judgment worth where new books are concerned? Certainly not 10 and 6 pence. And from the stores of their experience, they proceed to bring forth terrible examples of past blunders, crimes of criticism which, if they had been committed against the dead and not against the living, would have lost them their jobs and imperiled their reputations. The only advice they can offer is to respect one's own instincts, to follow them fearlessly, and, rather than submit them to the control of any critic or reviewer alive, to check them by reading and reading again the masterpieces of the past. Thanking them humbly, we cannot help reflecting that it was not always so. Once upon a time, we must believe, there was a rule, a discipline, which controlled the great republic of readers in a way which is now unknown. That is not to say that the great critic, the Dryden, the Johnson, the Coleridge, the Arnold, was an impeccable judge of contemporary work, whose verdict stamped the book indelibly and saved the reader the trouble of reckoning the value for himself. The mistakes of those great men about their own contemporaries are too notorious to be worth recording, but the mere fact of their existence had a centralizing influence. That alone, it is not fantastic to suppose, would have controlled the disagreements of the dinner table and given to random chatter about some book just out in authority now entirely to seek. The diverse schools would have debated as hotly as ever, but at the back of every reader's mind would have been the consciousness that there was at least one man who kept the main principles of literature closely in view, who, if you had taken to him some eccentricity of the moment, would have brought it into touch with permanence, and tethered it by his own authority in the contrary blasts of praise and blame. Footnote 15. How violent these are two quotations will show. It, told by an idiot, should be read as The Tempest should be read, and as Gulliver's Travels should be read. For if Miss Macauley's poetic gift happens to be less sublime than those of the author of The Tempest, and if her irony happens to be less tremendous than that of the author of Gulliver's Travels, her justice and wisdom are no less noble than theirs. The Daily News. The next day we read, for the rest one can only say that if Mr. Eliot had been pleased to write in demotic English, the wasteland might not have been, as it just is to all but anthropologists and literati, so much waste paper. The Manchester Guardian. And footnote 15. But when it comes to the making of a critic, nature must be generous and society ripe. The scattered dinner tables of the modern world, the chase and eddy of the various currents which compose the society of our time, could only be dominated by a giant of fabulous dimensions. And where is even the very tall man whom we have the right to expect? Reviewers we have, but no critic. A million competent and incorruptible policemen, but no judge. Men of taste and learning and ability are forever lecturing the young and celebrating the dead. But the too frequent result of their able and industrious pens is a desiccation of the living tissues of literature into a network of little bones. Nowhere shall we find the downright vigor of a Dryden, or Keats with his fine and natural bearing, his profound insight and sanity, or Flaubert and the tremendous power of his fanaticism, or Coleridge, above all, brewing in his head the whole of poetry, and letting issue now and then one of those profound general statements which are caught up by the mind when hot with the friction of reading, as if they were the soul of the book itself. And to all this, too, the critics generously agree. A great critic, they say, is the rarest of beings. But should one miraculously appear, how should we maintain him? On what should we feed him? Great critics, if they are not themselves great poets, are bred from the profusion of the age. There is some great man to be vindicated, some school to be founded or destroyed. But our age is meager to the verge of destitution. There is no name which dominates the rest. There is no master in whose workshop the young are proud to serve apprenticeship. Mr. Hardy has long since withdrawn from the arena, and there is something exotic about the genius of Mr. Conrad, which makes him not so much an influence as an idol, honored and admired, but aloof and apart. As for the rest, though they are many and vigorous and in the full flood of creative activity, there is none whose influence can seriously affect his contemporaries, or penetrate beyond our day to that not very distant future which it pleases us to call immortality. If we make a century our test, and ask how much of the work produced in these days in England will be in existence then, we shall have to answer not merely that we cannot agree upon the same book, but that we are more than doubtful whether such a book there is. It is an age of fragments, a few stanzas, a few pages, a chapter here and there. The beginning of this novel, the end of that, are equal to the best of any age or author. But can we go to posterity with a sheaf of loose pages, or ask the readers of those days, with the whole of literature before them, to sift our enormous rubbish heaps for our tiny pearls? Such are the questions which the critics might lawfully put to their companions at table, the novelists and poets. At first, the weight of pessimism seems sufficient to bear down all opposition. Yes, it is a lean age, we repeat, with much to justify its poverty. But, frankly, if we pit one century against another, the comparison seems overwhelmingly against us. Waverley, The Excursion, Kubla Khan, Don Juan, Hazlitt's Essays, Pride and Prejudice, Hyperion, and Prometheus Unbound were all published between 1800 and 1821. Our century has not lacked industry. But if we ask for masterpieces, it appears on the face of it that the pessimists are right. It seems as if an age of genius must be succeeded by an age of endeavor, riot and extravagance by cleanliness and hard work. All honor, of course, to those who have sacrificed their immortality to set the house in order. But if we ask for masterpieces, where are we to look? A little poetry, we may feel sure, will survive. A few poems by Mr. Yeats, by Mr. Davies, by Mr. de la Mare. Mr. Lawrence, of course, has moments of greatness, but hours of something very different. Mr. Beerbohm, in his way, is perfect, but it is not a big way. Passages in Far Away and Long Ago will undoubtedly go to posterity entire. Ulysses was a memorable catastrophe, immense in daring, terrific in disaster. And so, picking and choosing, we select now this, now that, hold it up for display, hear it defended or derided, and finally have to meet the objection that even so we are only agreeing with the critics that it is an age incapable of sustained effort, littered with fragments, and not seriously to be compared with the age that went before. But it is just when opinions universally prevail, and we have added lip service to their authority, that we become sometimes most keenly conscious that we do not believe a word that we are saying. It is a barren and exhausted age, we repeat. We must look back with envy to the past. Meanwhile, it is one of the first fine days of spring. Life is not altogether lacking in color. The telephone, which interrupts the most serious conversations and cuts short the most weighty observations, has a romance of its own. and the random talk of people who have no chance of immortality, and thus can speak their minds out, has a setting, often, of lights, streets, houses, human beings, beautiful or grotesque, which will weave itself into the moment forever. But this is life. The talk is about literature. We must try to disentangle the two, and justify the rash revolt of optimism against the superior plausibility, the finer distinction of pessimism. Our optimism, then, is largely instinctive. It springs from the fine day, and the wine, and the talk. It springs from the fact that when life throws up such treasures daily suggests more than the most voluble can express. Much though we admire the dead, we prefer life as it is. There is something about the present which we would not exchange, though we were offered a choice of all past ages to live in. And modern literature, with all its imperfections, has the same hold on us and the same fascination. It is like a relation whom we snub and scarify daily, but after all, cannot do without. It has the same endearing quality of being that which we are, that which we have made, that in which we live, instead of being something, however august, alien to ourselves and beheld from the outside. Nor has any generation more need than ours to cherish its contemporaries. We are sharply cut off from our predecessors. A shift in the scale, the war, the sudden slip of masses held in position for ages, has shaken the fabric from top to bottom, alienated us from the past, and made us perhaps too vividly conscious of the present. Every day we find ourselves doing, saying, or thinking things that would have been impossible to our fathers, and we feel the differences which have not been noted far more keenly than the resemblances which have been very perfectly expressed. New books lure us to read them partly in the hope that they will reflect this rearrangement of our attitude, these scenes, thoughts, and apparently fortuitous groupings of incongruous things which impinge upon us with so keen a sense of novelty, and, as literature does, give it back into our keeping, whole and comprehended. Here, indeed, there is every reason for optimism. No age can have been more rich than ours in writers determined to give expression to the differences which separate them from the past, and not to the resemblances which connect them with it. It would be invidious to mention names, but the most casual reader dipping into poetry, into fiction, into biography, can hardly fail to be impressed by the courage, the sincerity, in a word, by the widespread originality of our time. But our exhilaration is strangely curtailed. Book after book leaves us with the same sense of promise unachieved, of intellectual poverty, of brilliance which has been snatched from life, but not transmuted into literature. Much of what is best in contemporary work has the appearance of being noted under pressure, taken down in a bleak shorthand, which preserves with astonishing brilliance the movements and expressions of the figures as they pass across the screen. But the flash is soon over, and there remains with us a profound dissatisfaction. The irritation is as acute as the pleasure was intense. After all, then, we are back at the beginning, vacillating from extreme to extreme, at one moment enthusiastic, at the next pessimistic, unable to come to any conclusion about our contemporaries. We have asked the critics to help us, but they have deprecated the task. Now, then, is the time to accept their advice and correct these extremes by consulting the masterpieces of the past. We feel ourselves indeed driven to them, impelled not by calm judgment, but by some imperious need to anchor our instability upon their security. But, honestly, the shock of the comparison between past and present is at first disconcerting. Undoubtedly, there is a dullness in great books. There is an unabashed tranquility in page after page of Wordsworth and Scott and Miss Austen, which is sedative to the verge of somnolence. Opportunities occur, and they neglect them. Shades and subtleties accumulate, and they ignore them. They seem deliberately to refuse to gratify those senses which are stimulated so briskly by the moderns, the senses of sight, of sound, of touch, above all, the sense of the human being, his depth and the variety of his perceptions, his complexity, his confusion, his self, in short. There is little of all this in the works of Wordsworth and Scott and Jane Austen. From what, then, arises that sense of security, which gradually, delightfully, and completely overcomes us? It is the power of their belief, their conviction, that imposes itself upon us. In Wordsworth, the philosophic poet, this is obvious enough, but it is equally true of the careless Scot, who scribbled masterpieces to build castles before breakfast, and of the modest maiden lady, who wrote furtively and quietly simply to give pleasure. In both, there is the same natural conviction that life is of a certain quality. They have their judgment of conduct. They know the relations of human beings towards each other and towards the universe. Neither of them probably has a word to say about the matter outright, but everything depends on it. Only believe, we find ourselves saying, and all the rest will come of itself. Only believe, to take a very simple instance which the recent publication of the Watsons brings to mind, that a nice girl will instinctively try to soothe the feelings of a boy who has been snubbed at a dance, and then, if you believe it implicitly and unquestioningly, you will not only make people 100 years later feel the same thing, but you will make them feel it as literature. For certainty of that kind is the condition which makes it possible to write. To believe that your impressions hold good for others is to be released from the cramp and confinement of personality. It is to be free, as Scott was free, to explore with a vigor which still holds us spellbound the whole world of adventure and romance. It is also the first step in that mysterious process in which Jane Austen was so great an adept. The little grain of experience once selected, believed in, and set outside herself, could be put precisely in its place, and she was then free to make of it, by a process which never yields its secrets to the analyst, and to that complete statement which is literature. So then our contemporaries afflict us because they have ceased to believe. The most sincere of them will only tell us what it is that happens to himself. They cannot make a world, because they are not free of other human beings. They cannot tell stories, because they do not believe the stories are true. They cannot generalize. They depend on their senses and emotions, whose testimony is trustworthy, rather than on their intellects, whose message is obscure. And they have perforce to deny themselves the use of some of the most powerful and some of the most exquisite of the weapons of their craft. With the whole wealth of the English language at the back of them, they timidly pass about from hand to hand and book to book only the meanest copper coins. Set down at a fresh angle of the eternal prospect, they can only whip out their notebooks and record with agonized intensity the flying gleams, which light on what? And the transitory splendors, which may, perhaps, compose nothing whatever. But here the critics interpose, and with some show of justice. If this description holds good, they say, and is not, as it may well be, entirely dependent upon our position at the table, and certain purely personal relationships to mustard pots and flower vases, then the risks of judging contemporary work are greater than ever before. There is every excuse for them, if they are wide of the mark, and no doubt it would be better to retreat, as Matthew Arnold advised, from the burning ground of the present to the safe tranquility of the past. We enter on burning ground, wrote Matthew Arnold, as we approach the poetry of times so near to us, poetry like that of Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, of which the estimates are so often not only personal, but personal with passion. And this, they remind us, was written in the year 1880. Beware, they say, of putting under the microscope 1 inch of a ribbon, which runs many miles. Things sort themselves out if you wait. Moderation and a study of the classics are to be recommended. Moreover, life is short, the Byron centenary is at hand, and the burning question of the moment is, did he or did he not marry his sister? To sum up then, if indeed any conclusion is possible when everybody is talking at once and it is time to be going, it seems that it would be wise for the writers of the present to renounce for themselves the hope of creating masterpieces. Their poems, plays, biographies, novels are not books but notebooks, and time, like a good schoolmaster, will take them in his hands, point to their blots and narrations, and tear them across, but he will not throw them into the waste paper basket. He will keep them because other students will find them very useful. It is from notebooks of the present that the masterpieces of the future are made. Literature, as the critics were saying just now, has lasted long, has undergone many changes, and it is only a short sight and a parochial mind that will exaggerate the importance of these squalls, however they may agitate the little boats now tossing out at sea. The storm and the drenching are on the surface, and continuity and calm are in the depths. As for the critics whose task it is to pass judgment upon the books of the moment, whose work, let us admit, is difficult, dangerous, and often distasteful, let us ask them to be generous of encouragement, but sparing of those wreaths and coronets which are so apt to get awry and fade and make the wearers, in 6 months' time, look a little ridiculous. Let them take a wider, a less personal view of modern literature, and look indeed upon the writers as if they were engaged upon some vast building, which being built by common effort, the separate workmen may well remain anonymous. Let them slam the door upon the cozy company where sugar is cheap and butter plentiful. Give over, for a time at least, the discussion of that fascinating topic, whether Byron married his sister, and withdrawing, perhaps, a hand's breadth from the table where we sit chattering, say something interesting about literature. Let us buttonhole them as they leave, and recall to their memory that gaunt aristocrat, Lady Hester Stanhope, who kept the milk-white horse in her stable in readiness for the Messiah, and was forever scanning the mountain-tops, impatiently but with confidence, for signs of his approach, and asked them to follow her example. Scan the horizon, see the past in relation to the future, and so prepare the way for masterpieces to come. End of section 27. Read by Arden. July 28. End of The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf.